Well, there was the one guy in London that hired me to do kind of this, I guess you would call it a sadomasochistic kind of recording. And I just remember saying something about the whip crack hits your back, you know?
Podcast Junkies, episode 198. We are on our way to episode 200, coming so soon. And regular listeners of the show will know exactly what that means and actually who the guest is going to be. But if you're new to the show, then let's take a step back and I'll introduce myself. I'm Harry Duran. I'm the host of Podcast Junkies. Been doing this for over 5 years. I'm so privileged and honored to have conversations with amazing podcasters doing amazing things. And this week is no different. But first, last week, remember that I had a conversation with Cole Raven, if you were paying attention, and he's the co-founder of Podchaser. Podchaser is the IMDb of podcasts. And why that's important is because they're standardizing the way we show credits for our shows. And I'm really a big fan. I've been following them for a couple of years, and I think what they're doing is actually great. This week, we have the pleasure of speaking to Dawn Davis, as I mentioned, and she is the host of Desert Lady Diaries. This was a great conversation. Dawn and I met at Podcast Movement last year, and we actually have a common friend in Robin Maxwell. And if you've been paying attention, Robin and I were co-hosts on a new podcast series called An Alien in Hollywood, which is about the life and times of Ronald Shusett, the co-creator of Alien. So if you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to analieninhollywood.com, and you'll find the links for that. So we talked with Dawn about the genesis of Desert Lady Diaries and how she decides to have guests on her show. What's interesting is that she actually does them in person, I think with the exception of one. So we talk a little bit about the gear that she uses when she does that. She brought up the celebration of Juneteenth, which I actually knew nothing about. So listen in around a minute 11 and you'll find out as well if you don't know. She's planning for her upcoming 100th episode, and we talk a little bit about the research that goes into every show. She actually got her background doing podcasting and some expertise in it from the work she does as a voiceover artist. And so she talks about what she enjoys most about it, and how she got into it, and how that's allowed her to become a great interviewer, and how that's led to open and honest and vulnerable conversations with her guests. She has a passion for community organizing, so we talk a little bit about that. And that ties into her decision to move to the desert and become an integral part of the community, and why that's important for her. We dig into the special Diary Unlocked feature she's created only for Patreon users, and I'd never heard anything like this before, so that's about at minute 41, so listen out for that. It's something she's doing specifically for that community, and it's something you might get ideas from. So as always, full show notes are available at podcastjunkies.com/198. We have another sponsor back who's been here before, and it's Focusrite. And this is hot off the presses. The third generation line is now available. As if their 2G versions weren't enough, the Focusrite team now gets even better. And I've had the benefit of getting early access to the Scarlett 2i2 specifically, and it's safe to say that it boasts two of the best performing mic preamps the Scarlett range has ever seen. Or heard, I guess. There's now an air button, which is super cool. It's going to give your mic a brighter and more open sound, and they've added a quick start tool to get you up and running super fast. The bundled software now includes Ableton Live Lite, Avid Pro Tools Creative Pack, Softtube's Time and Tone bundle, and that includes 3 world-class reverb, delay, and distortion plugins. All of it included. In other words, guys, the best just got better. You've heard me talk about this preamp, the Scarlett 2i2 Focusrite, which I raved about in the past, and they've just improved it. So it's my number one recommendation for when you're ready to move directly from plugging the mic directly into your laptop and then want to add some control over the gain and specifically the headphone monitoring as well, which is really important. So Scarlett 2i2, check it out. Make sure you stay till the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. But for now, enjoy my conversation, wide-ranging as it is, with Dawn. So Dawn Davis, host of Desert Lady Diaries, thank you so much for joining us on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I always like for guests to give a little bit of background into how we first met or how we came across each other's paths. So do you remember that origin story?
Well, I do, and it's a little kinda crazy because I was at, we were both at Podcast Movement last year in Philadelphia, and you got on stage, and I looked at Jules, who you've had on the show, we met for the
Yeah.
first time there, and I said, "Mic drop," and she goes, "I know." We felt like we got so much out of your presentation, and then as the week went on, Jules had interaction with you, I did not for whatever reason, but a few months later, when I was about to interview one of the Desert Ladies, somehow your name came up in conversation with Robin Maxwell. And I'm like, she says, I think she sent me an email that said, I just got off the phone with Harry Duran and he said he knows you. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is too nuts. And you guys are now working on a project together, creating a podcast, which is
Yeah.
amazing. So, yeah, kind of wacky.
Sometimes things like that make really put a smile on my face, and I'm really a spiritual person, so I'm a really a big believer in like the universe putting things in your path and putting people in your path at just the right place and the right time. And sometimes some of the pieces are put in place, but they're not whatever quote unquote activated until like a year later or 3 years later. So to even think that I was, I had met you, and so I knew who you were, and then I, in a separate thread, was pursuing something with Robin, who I was interested in because of her book, and I'm a fan of all things Atlantis, and her amazing trilogy, Early Earth, just totally sucked me in. And the quick story on that is I reached out to her one off and say, "Hey, when are books 2 and 3 coming?" And then, as you know, Robin, and you've had her on the show,
Hmm. Right.
she's like, "It'd be better if we just talked on the phone. I'm not a big fan of this email thing." So,
Right.
and so we started that relationship. And as a result
Yeah.
of that, realized that she had a relationship with Ronald Shusett, who was one of the co-creators of Alien. And now we created an Alien in Hollywood as that podcast recently launched, which I think you got a chance to listen to as well, right?
Yeah.
So then, your podcast, you want to talk a little bit about how you came up with the idea, and eventually, obviously, how Robin ended up on the show. But where were you at your podcasting like timeline when you were at Podcast Movement?
I was probably, I want to say maybe somewhere between 50 and 60 episodes in,
Okay.
at that point. Yeah. But still always looking for new learning and new ways of being. And as a matter of fact, today I was going through a little stack of, oh, I got to get to that. I got to get to that. And in there is my podcast 18 or PM 18
Mm,
notes with a thing that says Harry Duran. So I pulled it out and I was like, I need to look at this to see what I'm using. And I think for me, the biggest thing that you recommended during that session was doing repurposing your content. And I
yeah.
totally took you up on the Throwback Thursday, and I've been doing it ever since. So thank you very much for that. But the origin story of the podcast was initially when I was living in Los Angeles, suddenly a friend of mine who was in a relationship for 10 years was out of a relationship, not by her choice. So she and I kind of started, we were good friends, but we started meeting every week and kind of reading books together about finance and relationships and being accountable to each other about our learnings. And at that point, I had this like epiphany of, you know what? As a woman of a certain age, I probably have some knowledge that I could offer some younger women about the direction of their lives. And I thought about starting a blog. I got the WordPress site set up.
Hmm.
I reached out to my 16-year-old who was 16 at the time, and I said to my niece, I said, "Do you have some questions that you would want to ask maybe not your mom, but somebody else about life in general?" She sent me like a dozen questions, and I set about beginning to write answers to those questions. I never launched the website.
Mm,
I just recently, within the last 2 months, finally let it go because I've been paying, the fee on it every year.
yeah.
So then fast forward to April of 2016, my same friend, Carrie, and Zach and I decide to come out to Joshua Tree. And I'd never been here before. Within 3 months, I was living here.
Wow.
And probably within, I don't know, 9 months after that, I realized that I was meeting some really amazing women out here that are either moved out here on their own or they've been living here for a super long time on their own. And they just all had such interesting backgrounds, and I wanted to know more about them. And then at some point, I don't know, you get your best ideas in the shower sometimes. I don't remember what it was that said, oh, why don't you do a podcast about these women? Because at the same time, I'm a voiceover and I do
Mm,
that for my living.
okay.
So it was a good way for me to like have a vehicle to put my voice out into the public for potential marketing, but also start a set about meeting these women and sharing their stories. And I think it just ultimately is listening to some of their stories. Some of them have been out here for 3 months. Some of them have been out here for, I don't know, 50 years, or they've lived their whole life here. But there's always some kind of really interesting challenge or struggle that they came up against and somehow maneuvered their way out of and, moved on successfully. So I think it's super valuable in that. And the people in the community have told me that, we go out and we see each other at events and it's like, hey, how are you doing? How's that thing? Okay, see you next time. We don't really dig into who are you? Where did you come from? How did you get
Mm,
here?
yeah.
What's your life about? And a lot of people now will approach me and say, I know her, but I didn't know that.
Mm.
So it's bringing more, I don't know if humanity is the right word, but it's just bringing a more human element to the community. It's not so surface, it's taking things deeper with at least the women in the community. Yeah.
And everyone that's been on the show is someone that is from that local community, and you've actually interviewed in person.
Absolutely. And there's only been one person so far that doesn't necessarily live here, but she's an author that lives in LA and comes out often and actually wrote a book called Wonder Valley, which is a community a little further east of where I am in Joshua Tree and past 29 Palms. So she came out and had a book signing at a couple of local places. And one of the community members in Wonder Valley reached out to me and said, hey, would you consider having her on the podcast? And we talked not only about the place, but we talked about the use of place in fictionalized material, because some people get a little offended when they see their place in a story and go, that's not how that is. That's not
Yeah,
how
yeah,
that
yeah.
is. So we kind of address that, which is kind of interesting. And turns out she and I also had in common doing some work down on Skid Row in LA. So yeah, it turned out to be a super interesting conversation.
So did you have a criteria in mind when you when you initially started the show, like the type of women that you wanted on, or is it just if anyone was doing something under the guise of interesting work in the desert that was a woman, that they were open for you to be a guest on your show?
People ask me all the time, how do you decide who comes on? And essentially, I first sat down, and because it was a new podcast, I reached out to my immediate circle of friends that I've made here in the desert because I pretty much knew they wouldn't turn me down. And they all have cool stuff that they're doing. And then the list just really grew from there. People coming on and saying, who you should talk to, and that sort of thing. Or I'm reading the local newspaper and I see some woman's doing some super cool thing. Like recently, I interviewed a young lady who is originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, celebrated Juneteenth all the time in Milwaukee, and now comes to the desert with her husband who's in the service out at the Marine base. And she said, I was asking my friends, so what do they do here for Juneteenth? And they were like, nothing. So she
I'm gonna
decided, go ahead.
No, I'm gonna say I'm gonna have to confess that I don't know what that is either. So,
Oh, okay. So Juneteenth is a celebration of the slaves in Texas finally finding out that they were actually free.
hmm.
So the slave owners were like not bringing that news to them, and then it finally made it down to Texas, and it was on June 19th. So they call it Juneteenth. Yeah.
And it's specific to Texas.
No, it's actually celebrated all over, and that's kind of what Kajil was saying. She goes, "I don't want people to think this is strictly an African American event. It's actually an American event. It was people realizing that they were free Americans, and we should
Mm.
all be celebrating that." So, and that's actually this weekend out in 29 Palms. She's doing that on Saturday. So I happened to read about that in the paper, and I thought, "Hey, that's something that I think people would be interested in." And we have a ton of artists and musicians here that are doing a lot of interesting work, and I've had women on that were running for Congress against our longstanding Republican congressman. I
Mm.
have had a woman on who is working with immigrant prisoners out at Adelanto, a prison here in Southern California. And it's just interesting because we don't have an opportunity, really. There's so much happening in our world. We don't necessarily have an opportunity to dig into all the specifics of certain things. And sometimes when I have people on, we can dig into those specifics because they are in the middle of doing it. So
So with the so what episode is about to drop now? What number are you up to?
I just dropped 92.
Okay, so you get I think I remember seeing it was in the 90s. So are you going to do anything special for 100?
I've been tossing that around, and at this moment in time, there really is no budget for the podcast, and financially, I'm not in a position to just throw a big party. So I've had thoughts of going out and finding sponsors to have an event and that sort of thing, but I've been involved in some other things that I've been working on, and just not enough time to dedicate to do it properly, and I don't want to do it, can I say, half-assed? So I just did.
You can.
Um, so, that's still kind of up in the air. I do know that for the 100th episode, my plan is to read some excerpts from a book that was written by a woman who moved here with her husband in the early 1900s and
Oh wow.
homesteaded. Before they built their homestead, they lived in a tent at the Oasis Samara for 4 months, which was like October to January. And the book is all about her kind of adventures and the different things that happened here in this area while they were making their life here. And the reason a lot of these folks came out here in the first place was that the men had mustard gas poisoning from World War One, and there was
Wow.
a doctor in Pasadena who was seeing all these men, and he's like, "You need to go to the desert. The air's drier. It's better for your lungs." So that's why a lot of those folks came out here to heal, and that's why they were here. So I've gone to the library because locally it's a reference book. I had to actually read it in the library.
Oh wow.
So I think it was last Wednesday. I went in at 1 and I left at 6, and I only had 4 chapters to go. So I reread those on Saturday morning. But what I did also is I marked pages of certain passages that were really like either really endearing or exemplified some challenges that they were experiencing here in during those times about growth, expansion, development. They're not the same as what we're experiencing here now, but it's just interesting to see that they were having a similar struggle with having people come out here. Yeah.
Well, I have been out there for a couple of times to Joshua Tree, so I can vouch for how beautiful it is out there.
Yeah.
Given what you just explained, I'm wondering now and curious as to how much research you actually do for each guest that you have on the show.
You know, Sometimes I just go online and I Google, and stuff comes up all the time that's really interesting. I had a local oil painter on, and I had found some really interesting information about her, like a life previous to oil painting.
Hmm.
And when she sat down, she immediately said, "And I don't want to talk about this part of my life." And I was like, "Darn it. It's so interesting.
Yeah, yeah,
Nobody
yeah.
knows this. Why?" So, I respect that. And when they sit down in front of me, I say, if there's anything I ask you that you don't want to answer, just raise your hand and, we don't need to talk about it. But yeah, not I don't do a whole lot of research. I ask them to send a 50-word bio,
Okay.
a photograph that can be used for social media promotion purposes, and any links or websites that they want to send people to afterward if they have. Sometimes they have businesses or products or art that they want people to see, so I want to get that out there.
I sometimes like to get into the nitty gritty and geek out on like the specifics of like the workflow. So, do you use like a scheduling tool, use Calendly or anything to make sure that you're not doing the back and forth dance on email?
Nope. I'm super old school when it comes to that, but I
Yeah.
do have templates. I
Okay.
did create some templates, like the reach out template, and I have the confirmation template, and I have the your episode is now up. Here's the link template. So I do make use of those templates. I read before I started doing the podcast. I did some research. I got books from the library, which was super dated um, from a technical standpoint, but from the logistics of putting all the pieces together, they were super helpful. And I think the biggest thing I took away from that was the block interviewing. And I was doing that a lot more last year
That's a
where
good one. Yeah.
I would schedule days where I would have 3 or 4 people come to my place. We'd do the interviews, and then you're not sweating like, "Oh shoot, I don't have any material for next week." And I've been in that position and I don't like being there. Or I know that I'm going out of town now. So I was just looking this morning and saying, oh, you need about 3 people to come in through here the
Mm,
next 2 weeks. So I'll send the emails out and we'll, back and forth. I usually send a block of dates like this date or this date or this date at this or this
okay.
time and make it easy that way. Yeah. But I haven't used a tool. Mm-mm.
And what are you using gear-wise for the in-person recordings?
I use is it the AT 2100?
Okay, the ATR 2100.
Yeah, I use that. And
You use two of those, or do you go? Do you?
no, you know what? I'm using one.
Okay.
I have to. But
Yeah.
here's the problem. I am so non-technical. Like the mic, a funny story actually happened at Robin's when I went to interview her. So sometimes I will go to people's homes if like they only have one car or they live way out or they're 89 years old or, whatever. So I take my laptop and I take my microphone. At that time I was using what is that called? It's called a Blue Eyeball. So it had a camera and a microphone, right? And I would just set that up. Well, I got to
Mm,
her house and I'd been having some difficulty with it. I mean, the thing was about 15 years old to begin with. So I plugged it in a couple of interviews before her and it would just like cut out in the middle of the interview. And I had to say, sorry, can you repeat that or whatever? So I get to Robbins and we're doing the interview and it did it again. I'm like, wait a minute, I just have to jiggle this around a little bit and it wouldn't come back. And she looked at me and she goes, do you want to use my setup? I just got these microphones. Harry told me to buy them. So we plugged one in and
yeah.
went from there. So she was my savior that day.
I think she's because my newer recommendation is the Samson, which is what I'm using now, the Samson Q2U. And
Okay.
so it's good because it's the same features as the ATR 2100. So
Hmm.
it's got the USB connection in the back, and it's got the XLR. It's
Right.
got the volume control on the outside, so you can kind of see
Hmm.
that. And
Oh
and
yeah, yeah.
yeah, so it's got there. So and
Well,
then
I like the fact that you can plug it in two different ways because ultimately my ultimate goal is to get either the Tascam or a Zoom.
okay, yeah, the zoom's good.
Right.
And then the other good thing about the Samson, which is interesting, it's called handling noise. It's the noise that you hear when you're actually holding the microphone. And
Mm,
so what I've noticed with the ATR is you get more of that picked up on the actual recording. And so on the Samson, if you are going to eventually like add another mic, it's helpful for that when you're doing that, handing the microphone back and forth, or you going back and forth with the microphone. Because typically best practices, for remote conversations is just like I have it on a tripod right now,
right.
so I'm not moving it and I'm not touching it. So that's usually good. But if you are in a situation where you're at a conference or in people's houses, having without having to spend a couple of $100 for a studio quality like a Shure SM58, I think is what they typically
Hmm.
use. But that's just a good practice. So I'm just always curious about how
Yeah.
podcasters are setting up their stuff, and there's a unique set of challenges. I have done a couple of interviews in person, and you're just more nervous about whether or not you're actually capturing it, is it recording, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, because you can't really see it. I do mine all on my laptop, and I open up a program that I think is typically in the Mac called Sound Studio. So I've been using that for a long time in my voiceover work, and I just never change. So I use that all the time. So I always have the laptop and it's open, and I can see that it's recording. I know if I go to the Tascam or the Zoom, I'm not sure if there's a window on there that shows you
There
that,
is,
or
yeah. There's,
there
there's a
is.
little
Okay.
there's a little like a digital display.
Yeah. See, and then
Um,
with me, it's I'm like a technophobe, so that's a problem.
so how did you get into the voiceover work?
Well, a long time ago, I was working at Budget Rent a Car at Newark Airport, and one of my jobs was just to answer the phone. And there were numerous people who I answered the phone and either said, "Wow, you have a great voice. You should be on the radio." Or conversely said, "Are you on the radio? You have a great voice." And after hearing it enough times, I started thinking, you know what? Maybe there is something to this. So I took the PATH train over to the city and went and did a little thing at Connecticut School of Broadcasting.
Hmm,
And they wanted so much more money than I had to do
yeah.
that. So I came back home and I'm like, okay, what are you going to do now? So I found a woman, oddly enough, in the back of like a monthly magazine, like New Jersey Magazine or something. And she lived up in North Jersey. And I would go up there Saturdays and we'd work on it for 2 or 3 hours. And then I kind of backburnered it. I was actually working full time for a bank. I got transferred from Jersey to Charlotte, North Carolina. And then I was in Charlotte for a number of months, and that's when all of the acting and voiceover stuff suddenly started to go. I auditioned for a local community theater. I started taking teleprompter and voiceover classes. So that's really where that all started and where it came from.
And how long have you been doing that now?
Gosh, it's over 20 years, probably
Oh, wow.
22 years. Yeah.
Any interesting voiceover work stories?
Well, there was the one guy in London that hired me to do kind of this, I guess you would call it a sadomasochistic kind of recording. And I just remember saying something about the whip crack hits your back, you know? So that's probably the most interesting. Typically, it's these 30-second spots for like car dealerships in Florida
Yeah.
or, yeah. Although I have a funny story. My parents moved from Jersey to Delaware about 12 years ago. And I don't know, about a year ago, my mother texts me and she goes, "Did you do a spot for just some kind of construction company?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I do stuff every day. I have no idea where it's going or where. And she's like, "I'm sure it's you." And I go, "Well, give me the name of it and I'll look." Because sometimes I keep stuff. And sure enough, it was. She's like, "I knew it. I'm sitting here at the computer and all of a sudden you're in the room with me." So that was kind of fun.
That is fun. What do you like the most about it?
I think that the ability to work from home is just amazing. And I was the kid in school who loved when the teacher said, "Okay, who wants to read the first paragraph? Who wants to read the next paragraph?" I was always the one who wanted to read out loud, which I think is an interesting observation. I don't know where that came from, but so I set up my walk-in closet here with my moving blankets on the walls and my
Mm-hmm.
Sennheiser, and I bring the laptop in and I do my work, and it's awesome.
So what model are you using for the voiceover recordings?
It's the Sennheiser 421 MK something.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah,
not a
something.
dynamic microphone. That's meant to be in a studio. So you really have to be you have to have some serious sound dampening in that closet, right?
Right, yeah, and I have, the Focusrite Scarlett is
Oh,
my,
yeah.
preamp. Yeah. So I got the major setup in there, but the closet is not big enough to have people in to interview, so I don't do that. I do it at my kitchen table, so sound quality is consistent
Mm-hmm.
typically, but it does suffer a bit because there's a linoleum floor. I do put a, tablecloth on the tile
Okay.
table, but other than that, I mean, and then I run it through. I have a graphic equalizer setting that one of my friends came and did. He came over and he's like, "Let me show you, blah blah blah." And I'm like,
Mm.
it was like Charlie Brown's teacher talking, "Wah, wah, wah, wah." And I'm going, "Can you just set it and leave it, and
Yeah,
I'll just
set it and
use that
forget it.
setting."
Yeah.
Right, I'll just use that setting every time. And then I did a couple book recordings for ACX, and at the time
Oh,
they had
yeah.
a requirement that you run stuff through a program called Levelator.
Yeah, yeah.
So I still had that, and like suddenly, like I don't know, 10 episodes in, I'm like, "Hey, maybe I should." And it sounds super.
Oh,
It
yeah.
it really helps. So I do those two things, and it sounds pretty good.
There's also Auphonic, which we use for clients shows. It's auphonic.com.
Okay.
And they do mastering, leveling, and you get 2 hours free a month, and then you just buy credits if
Oh,
you need it. So if you've got less than 2 hours worth of audio a month, then it's free. I've met the founder of the tool.
mm,
Their noise reduction is just like amazing, and we run
wow.
everything through there. And the other bonus is you can ID3 tag your episode. So if
Oh,
you have chapter notes, if you have a summary, if you have artwork, you do that
right.
all in Auphonic, and then you export it. And then it's also now connecting to Libsyn and Blueberry and some of the other hosts. So you can
Mm,
literally put your raw audio in Auphonic, add in your ID3 tag info, and then send it to Libsyn in one interface. And you can also connect, I think, SoundCloud and YouTube. So
oh,
for
that's
solo,
great.
yeah, for solo podcasters, it's what I used
Right.
really early on, and we just kept using it for clients because a lot of the features,
Hmm.
um, rather than try to fiddle with all the different plugins and settings, like some of the like your audio engineer friend showed you,
Right.
they just have algorithms
Yeah.
that kind of fix the majority of stuff and get it leveled. So that's a really really helpful to try out.
Yeah. I wrote it down on your page
Yeah,
of notes.
yeah. Harry's notes to be continued.
Yes.
The 2019 version. So you did you grow up in Jersey, you said?
I did. Born and raised. I didn't leave till I was, I think I was in my 30s. It was like 1996. Yeah. I left and went to Charlotte.
I think we may have mentioned this in an email or something like that because I grew up in Yonkers. in
Oh,
Yonkers, New
yeah,
York.
or maybe
Yeah,
we had a brief conversation a couple months ago too, that might have been it. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Well, and, people will look at me and go, "Where's your accent?" And I
yeah.
say, people pay a lot of money to reduce any accent, but I think it was just by virtue of moving to different areas of the country. So I left
Hmm.
Jersey and I lived in North Carolina. If you'd known me when I moved to North Carolina, I would have been introducing myself to you as, "Hi, I'm Dawn Davis." Yeah. So then North Carolina really softened it out. Then I
Oh
ended
yeah,
up in Cleveland and that, Midwestern thing. And
yeah.
then Florida,
Wow.
same. Yeah, so it really just kind of went away and softened. Although when I get excited about something or I get really angry about something, that
It
comes
comes
right
out.
out. Mhm. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because the whole combination of the different dialects or just ways of speaking in different parts of the country, the fact that you got to experience them in different parts probably set you up well for the voiceover work.
Yeah, because a lot of jobs actually will request like Midwestern American accent, which is essentially like no accent.
Monotone, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, so I've got that going for me.
So talk to me a little bit about when you started interviewing people. Had you done interviews before, or how did you prepare for that aspect of it? Given that it's going to be, it was essentially the format you chose for your show.
Right. I have never interviewed anyone before except for jobs, like when I was a manager at the bank. So that's totally different. I think it was helpful to read those, like I said, those dated books really had some good information. So basically, I sat down and came up with a list of questions of like, what would people want to know about people living in the desert? And I think I probably have about, I don't know, 20 or 25 questions on the sheet. But now I find people come in and sit down and because they send me a bio and then I do a little, quick Google search on them and I come up with maybe some other things to ask about, the conversation goes really organically. And I've actually gotten some feedback from a number of people who listen to say, I feel like I'm on a fly on the wall in a friend's conversation. And I'm like, that is the best compliment that anyone can give me. So I don't worry too much about it. Now, I will tell you that I've had a couple people, and it's interesting. Sometimes it's the people that are on you and on you and on you. Like, I really want to be on. I really want to be on. I want to talk about this. And then they get here and they don't really talk. Those are the days I say I earn my money.
Yeah.
And those are the days when I still, to this day, every time have those questions in front of me in the event that that happens. And I have to refer to them when things get, I start getting these one sentence responses
Hmm.
or, that sort of stuff. Those are the hardest days.
How have you grown as an interviewer now that you're getting over 90 episodes? And if you think about how you were when you started those first couple of episodes, and how you feel about handling those interviews now.
I think that I've learned to go deeper.
Hmm.
When somebody says they had maybe, yeah, there was just this feeling when I came here, and I say, can you talk more about that?
Hmm.
What did it feel like? Was
Yeah.
it smells, sights? What was it? Just digging in deeper that way, I think. And I think it helps being a naturally curious person.
Yeah.
I think that helps a lot. But overall, and of course, I was taking notes when Terry Gross was giving her keynote. And then I went to the library and she actually wrote a book
Okay.
that includes some of her like questions and interviews and the techniques that she had to use to get around things but otherwise it's just happened pretty organically for me. Yeah, which I'm happy about, knock on wood.
And have you ever had an experience, when you start interviewing enough people, you get to hear some pretty personal stories, or you just make people feel so comfortable that they share something, sometimes they say the words that every podcaster wants to hear, like, I've never told anyone this before, or something like that.
Yeah, actually, it just happened yesterday, and it happens because I'm a pretty empathic, sensitive, emotional person, and it just happened yesterday. I had a young lady sitting here talking about the fact that she hadn't celebrated her 50th birthday, yet because she had just moved to the desert last year and things were really difficult financially and she wasn't sure she was going to be able to afford to stay here. There was so much going on. She said, so I didn't feel I could celebrate my 50th birthday. I didn't celebrate Thanksgiving. I didn't. And she started to get emotional. Of course, when I see somebody getting emotional, then I start to feel for them and get emotional. And she started to apologize. I said, no, this is where this conversation needed to happen. And thank you for your bravery and your honesty in sharing that. And those, I think, are what draws people in because it's a real humanistic story. And it may harken back to a time in their lives when they were feeling in a similar
Yeah.
position. So to be able to bring that to be able to have that connection with the person I'm interviewing and to be able to give that to the audience is amazing.
Has that one been released yet?
No, I just recorded yesterday, so it'll come out
Okay.
next Tuesday.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm that behind. It's kind of I'm on the edge, like, oh my God, if this
Yeah,
lady cancels on Friday, I'm screwed. Yeah,
it's every podcaster's nightmare to be running out, and
exactly.
especially when you've committed. Have you been pretty consistent with the release schedule?
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah, that was one of the things that was totally driven home to me in all of that material I read before I started was if you want any chance to get a steady audience, you need to be consistent.
Yeah.
You need to put your stuff out. So, Monday night I have a little part-time job that I work till 5:30. The local community, like municipal advisory council meeting was at 5:30. I didn't get home until 8. I made a salad. I sat down and started my upload. That's when I typically do it on Monday night. I start, but I try to do my process on Sundays. Have Sunday mornings have kind of become podcast church for me. So I do all my editing. And I edit, I don't move stuff around. It's just taking out the ums, the
Yeah.
ands, those mouth
The-
noises and things like that, false start sentences.
yeah.
And then I run it through all those programs. I have to make it an
Hmm.
MP3 to upload to Libsyn, all that mechanical stuff, write the blog post, write the newsletter. I've got 93 people on a newsletter. They get the newsletter every week with the new episode. Schedule all the social media. I have a free Hootsuite account. So I go in and I have my times and I just pop in the photo, write up my little blurb and do that. So all of that typically gets done before Monday night. So then all I have to do is upload to Libsyn and then send them the link.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
You mentioned being on or attending a municipality board meeting or something like that, and
mhm.
then
Yeah.
the concept around organizing people in the community. Is this like something that you're passionate about, like organizing and like getting groups of people together and sort of rallying behind causes?
Well, yeah, and it's amazing what a community we have here to do that. We recently, after a 10-year fight where a number of people in the community actually stepped up and got an attorney and started a GoFundMe, and people in the community contributed anywhere from $5 to $500 based on what you could afford to fight a 248 home gated community that some developer wanted to put here in Joshua Tree. Now, if anyone listening has never been to Joshua Tree, because I know you said you have, it's a very unique place. We have a really small little downtown village. All of the stores are mom and pop. No corporate entities have breached the gate until recently, which was also a fight with Dollar General, who
Mm.
now will have 5 stores in a 22-mile radius, which is
Wow.
absolutely ridiculous and greedful. So you hear me, I'm getting a little annoyed right now. So that's been a 6 or 7-year fight to keep them out. And it didn't work. So we're all very hyper vigilant about keeping this because once it turns into that with
Yeah.
every like fast food and box store on the highway, who wants to come here?
Yeah.
Nobody. They have that at home. Why would they come here and experience the wide open spaces of nature and Walmart's on the corner? It's just crazy town. So we're constantly We have a group that's pretty active, I would say. And then we have our own like little Facebook page that we all like, what are we
Hmm.
going to do about this? And, we just do it. And as a matter of fact, there's a woman that I am going to be interviewing, hopefully at the end of July. She's got a lot of stuff going on. I'm not trying to get her in. She was the one who was very instrumental in getting the group that fought that 248
Mm,
gated home community. So I just want to talk to her about that. And she's been here a long time too. So it's always great to have people on who have been here a long time and have
yeah,
seen the changes and the waves of people that come and go and things like that. It's or even just what places look like. Like, yeah, that was never there before. It was over here, and just learning a little bit about the area. And I have a number of people who listen who either have been here and visited and maybe picked up my card in one of the local shops because I go in and put my stuff everywhere,
yeah.
hang it on the boards and everything. Kansas, Canada. I mean, they're all
That's
over the
great.
place. Yeah, and every once in a while they'll send me an email that says, "Gosh, I didn't even know that. I'm so glad you've been talking about that on the podcast." Or, we were there and we want to move there, but we don't know when that's going to happen. But listening to your podcast helps us, feel like we know what's going on in the
Wow,
community. And
that's
so
good.
that's really awesome. I'm really glad that that's happening. Yeah.
Well, I'm really a fan of super niche and hyper local podcasts.
Well, it doesn't get much more niche than what I'm doing.
Well, it's interesting, Dawn, because it's I think it's there's a real need for that, and I think there's someone that actually has a podcast. Of course, there's a podcast about niche podcasts.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah,
Who
yes.
do you know? Yeah, I'd love to hear
I
about it.
think I remember. I gotta think back because it's something I you know who does something similar. Mark Bourbon, who no Mark Bologna, who was Beyond Bourbon Street. And so he does a local one on New Orleans, and I
Oh,
think
okay,
I could connect you with him. And I think he mentioned the group. So I think
great.
this idea of helping each other out and rising tide lifting all boats, especially since you guys are doing something similar and have similar challenges.
Exactly,
I could I
yeah,
could
and
I could see a need. And have you been able? So one of the thoughts about that is
mm,
leveraging the fact that it is local. Has that in any way helped you or given you some ideas about what you can do in terms of local sponsorship?
I think about it all the time, and I actually just January put up. I'm actually doing a Patreon right now, so I've got about 5 or 6 patrons. And what I've done is because the challenge for me was time. So a couple of months ago, I put together like a one sheet of all kinds of
Yeah.
sponsorship stuff. I went in because I keep track of my stats on a regular
Hmm.
basis, and I have them in a spreadsheet and all that kind of stuff. So I'm prepared to approach,
Yeah.
but I kind of wanted to go the Patreon route first and see how that worked for me. The difficulty was, what do I offer that isn't going to take much more time? Because, dude, as you know,
Yeah.
that is the biggest factor in all this, especially if you're doing it and you're not really getting paid. I mean, you
Yeah.
still have to pay the podcast host, you still have to pay for the website. If I have stuff on SoundCloud, I learned very quickly that I needed to get the maximum premium membership because they just drop your stuff off
Yeah. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
you load more new stuff, and I was panicking. So there's costs involved. So I just started with the Patreon, and I was thinking, what can I do? What can I offer that's worth it? So what I've done is I've come up with this diary unlocked.
Hmm.
And I have a sheet of 50 questions that at the end of the episode, I say, so now for our Patreon supporters, I want you to pick 4 random numbers between 1 and 50. And then they pick those 4 numbers, and I read the questions and I say, if you're interested in hearing, her answers to these questions,
That's
go out
cool.
to Desert Lady Diaries, click on the support page, blah, blah, blah. And so I've got like 5 or 6 people, and it ends up being about a 6 or 10 minute segment,
Yeah.
and then I put that up on Patreon for patrons only,
Okay.
and people seem to really like it. And I just got stickers made for Desert Lady Diaries, so I reached out to my patrons and I said, "I want to give you something else, so send me your address and I'll mail
Yeah.
you, some stickers and stuff like that." So, but the sponsorship, yeah, I'm definitely it's on my mind, but it's always just the approach and who to approach. I have in mind who I'd like to approach,
Hmm.
and really here, the time to approach is at high tourist season. So I've
Yeah.
just about missed my window because now we're going into low tourist season because, of
Hmm.
course, it's 105 outside. Nobody's hiking in the park.
Well, it's interesting. I think with that approach, you just try to get the early ones on board, but in a way that is reminding them that you're also reaching out to everyone else, in that neighborhood. So, and say, hey,
Right.
we're coming to you first, but by the way, these are the other 20, vendors that we're
Mm,
also going to be reaching out to. And it's
good
limited
idea.
inventory. I only have 2 spots. I have 2 pre-rolls, 2 mid-rolls, and 2, whatever you want to do, 2 post-rolls. And
Right.
so there's a little bit of scarcity there. And then you package it in a way. And this is what we talk about with clients, where you say, you don't focus on the downloads, because essentially it's not going to really mean a
Mm,
lot. And you're not going to be commanding a CPM, a
no.
cost per thousand, that's going to be meaningful. What
Right.
you're advertising is your platform reach, not your specific episode reach. So say, this is what we have.
Right.
And so you look at everything you have in terms of LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook group, Facebook page, email list, download listens, and then it becomes this one big number. And you're like, and then what
Mm,
you tell them is like, this is my reach. And then
okay.
you also talk about the demographics of the people listening, and the fact that people who are of this community, who support this community, and who are interested in moving to this community are now included in that list. And all of a sudden, the combination of that demographic and your reach becomes interesting to them, because as a company, you want to know that your advertising dollars are going to your ideal customer. And
Right.
I think you can easily demonstrate that the people listening to your show are essentially like their ideal customer, because they're really interested in, this part of town, and this
Right.
and this area, and that'll just as incentive for them. So, whether it's
Right.
some of the local merchants, in Pioneer Town, or the bar and
Right.
saloon, or the bar and saloon. I mean, I've been there, so I know there's a lot of places that
Oh, yeah. Hmm.
wouldn't mind to mention. And then you package it up as a 3-month deal. So you
Right.
figure out what a per episode charge is, and say, look, it's this per episode, but if you buy the 3 months, it's 13 episodes. And then
Hmm.
that way you don't have to go hunting people down like every week or every month for sponsorship. And
Right.
if you lock
Yeah.
them in for the 3 months is good for you, because you get to do one ad read, and you don't have to chase down sponsors. It's good for them because they get mentioned potentially like 13 or 26 times, whatever, on every
Well,
single,
plus
all these
the
episodes.
evergreen of it is that,
Yes, exactly.
anybody that goes out and listens at any time, whether it
Yeah,
was the first episode or the 22nd episode, that's in the ads in there. So they're
yeah.
still getting mileage on it too.
And lastly, it's even good for the listener, because they've proven that it usually takes about 7 to 8 times of hearing something before you actually think about purchasing it. And so, since you're a trusted resource and the people know who you are, any recommendations that you make, they're gonna be like, well, if Dawn supports this product, and obviously, I'm sure you wouldn't put your name behind any product you don't stand behind anyway. Yeah.
You know me well.
So, talk a little bit about, you said from when you arrived there, was it a couple of weeks, you said, or within a month?
Well, it was, let's see, we came up and visited April of 2016, and by the end of July, I had signed a lease.
Wow. Can you point your finger to anything specifically, or just what was it that convinced you so quickly?
Well, initially, what happened was we drove up, and when you drive up, there's those two hills you have to come up, right? So the first one is the Morongo grade, and the next one is the Yucca grade for Yucca Valley. And literally, as soon as we hit the top of the Morongo grade, I could feel like it was like someone was pulling a string to my head, and and I was looking around at these trees and everything. I was like, something's going on here for me, because it was a physical response.
Wow.
All weekend, I was just looking around, and even on our way up to the park, because that's the first thing we did when we came in, was drive up there. And I said, I noticed all these little houses along the way up Coil Springs, and I said, maybe I could get a piece of property out here, and you could put tiny houses, and you could come and visit me on the weekends. But all weekend, I was just very interested, and I went home and immediately got to work researching. And I came across a couple of websites where I saw how activist community there was here, which is really appealing to me. And that, just so I didn't think I was romanticizing the whole thing about moving, I was like, I probably need to make a few more visits out there. So it was this one visit that I came out that was really like the clincher. Before I left town, I signed up for an Airbnb, and I was coming out to do a workshop. And I said to my friend Carrie, I said, I don't know what it is, but I just feel like this guy is going to ask me to house sit. I can't explain it. And in the meantime, I called the chamber and I said, I'm going to, do people go away in the summer? Do they need somebody to house it? Thinking, it's July. If I can make it through a summer week in there, I can manage. So he's like, yeah, you can hang up flyers at the health food store, blah, blah, blah. So I made up flyers before I left and, booked the Airbnb. I got here on Saturday, drove up to the Airbnb. I sat down with Tom, the host, on the front porch, and I just broke into tears. And I was like, you have to understand something. I'm thinking about moving here. And this is one of the reasons why. The silence. If you've been up here,
Oh
it's
yeah,
so quiet. And coming from,
totally.
downtown LA, living there for 3.5 years, being here was just like unbelievable. So I went to the workshop, and then Sunday evening, I was at the Airbnb and I was coloring or something on the front porch. And he comes out and sits down and he goes, well, I'm going camping next week in Denver. I'm like, that's awesome. He's like, well, it would be, except that I forgot to block off the Airbnb and 2 people booked. And it just like went right over my head. And I
Yeah.
looked at him and I said, oh gosh, what are you going to do? And he's like, well, you were talking about house sitting. Dude, I almost fell off the chair. I was thinking, this is really happening. It's really happening right now. So I said, well, you know what? I didn't bring my laptop. I didn't bring my computer with me. I got to go back to LA and check and see what I got going on. So I did, and I was fine. We discussed where I was going to leave the key as I was packing my car. He comes out with this like BB rifle and he goes, just keep this nearby in case you, and I'm like, what? And he says, and I put a BB pistol underneath the pillow. Just leave it there when you're sleeping, just in case. And I'm like, oh my God. And on
Wow.
top of that, he had no swamp coolers in the place. And if you're not familiar, that's like a desert thing of how people keep their homes cool. You can look it up online. I can't really explain it because I don't have one. I have AC. So he had no swamp cooler, no air conditioners, window or otherwise. He just had like floor fans. So
Hmm.
at night, there were a couple of nights when I was there by myself, and you would just hear like somebody on an off-road vehicle. I'm like, why did you stop? Keep going. So I didn't leave the fans on at night because I didn't want to
Oh my
not
God.
hear somebody approaching. It was like a little nerve-wracking, quite honestly. But while I was here for 8 days, I made a go of checking out a couple of places to live, and I found this apartment place. So by the
Hmm.
end of the week, I had the application filled out. I dropped it off on my way back to LA. She called me the next day and said, if you could send me this, this, and this, I can go ahead and write up your lease. When do you want to come and sign it? And I was like,
Wow.
holy crap. So it was like the total, I call it the green light syndrome.
Hmm.
There was no impediment to my first thought of, when I got back to LA initially after the first visit, I went to buy something from a friend of mine at her loft. She was selling these t-shirts and stuff. And she said, so what have you been doing? I go, well, we just got back from Joshua Tree, and dude, I can't believe the place. She goes, well, do you know so-and-so? He has a place up there and he's looking for a manager. And I'm like, what is happening? So there were just way too many coincidences. And the last thing I will say about this is that ever since I moved out of my parents' home in New Jersey, every place I've ever lived on my own, I have decorated as if it were the desert.
Oh, that's
I've
funny.
had like little adobe houses or pictures of cactuses or dish towels with cactuses, comforter with, Native American prints, the whole schmeal. And when I got into this apartment and I looked out the window, the first thing I said to this lady was, I feel like I've been waiting for or preparing for this my whole life. It's inside and outside now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's an amazing
So
story.
there was just something in me that I think knew I was coming here, and it took me a long circuitous route to get here, but I'm here.
Yeah, sometimes they are longer than we think or thought they might have been. But
Right.
what's so interesting is that that feeling that you felt, that intuition that you were in the right place, is
Yeah.
so strong, and I'm sure it's something that you've been paying attention to closely your whole life.
Well, no, I don't know about that. I think there were times when I was at the bank
Mm,
that I was just so focused on getting through the
yeah,
week and then coming in on the weekend to take care of my email because I couldn't get to it during the week. And, those times I don't think I was as aware, but your body and your mind will push you sometimes to certain places that you really are surprised that you end up, and that jars you. And I think Cleveland
yeah.
for me was that place. Yeah. That's when things really turned on a dime and I said,
Mm.
what? You need to do something differently. Yeah.
And what's interesting is that now you've become such an integral part of the community, and because of your activism roots, and
Mhm.
tendencies now, and what you're doing with the podcast. It's like you didn't just come to just be a consumer and just another resident in that area. I mean, you're actually
Right.
contributing. You're a storyteller, and you're also an archivist of sorts, because now there's a lot of people whose stories I'm sure would have gone untold had it not been for your show.
Right. And what's exciting about that is it's funny you should say that word archivist because probably about 3 months ago, I reached out to the 29 Palms Historical Society and said, would you have any interest in taking in these interviews into your archives? And they said yes. So far, I want to say there's probably about half are there now. What I've been doing is I've been using this Otter is a
Yeah.
transcription.
Yep.
So I've also been you can only do so many for free, because I am on a budget. So I keep loading them in there every month when I, hit my limit. And yeah, so any episodes that I've done so far and any future episodes are part of the archives of the 29 Palms Historical Society. So I walked into this to, market my voice and tell stories of women, and I'm walking out kind of leaving a legacy, which is super cool and something that I never would have really anticipated or thought about.
That's awesome and incredibly inspiring. And I'm sure for anyone who's even thinking of starting or is at that episode 1 or 6 or 12, that we've all been there. So I think
Right.
that's why I love telling these stories, because it's inspiring. And I don't think you realize the impact you're going to have if you stay with it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and people say all the time, "Well, how many are you gonna do? When will it end?" I'm like, "I have no idea." I've got over 250 women's names on a list, and I'm
Mm,
only at number 92, and I keep getting them all the time. Like, I was at that meeting Monday night for the Municipal Advisory Council, and the woman who got up to do the community report for, California Highway Patrol was a woman, and I'm like,
mm,
I bet she's got some stories. So I just literally they record the meeting. So they just put it up, I think yesterday or today. And I'm going in there to get her name so that then, because I was going to give her a card, but she snuck out before the
mm.
meeting was over. So, and I didn't go chasing her down. I figured I could find her somehow. So it just happens all the time where I suddenly see something in the paper or I meet somebody or I hear somebody speaking. That's how I got Robin on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
I went to, we have a semi-annual event called Desert Stories, and she was one of the stories that was told about. I don't know if she's ever told you the story about the fire
Oh,
that
yeah.
they had up there and the escape that they had to make. And I just was glued to her story. And I said, I have got to talk to this woman. So, I put her on the list when I started, but it was months before I got
Mm,
there because I'm only doing one a week.
yeah. I love teasing out content so people can listen to that specific episode of
Yeah.
Desert Lady Diaries. So, a couple questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Ooh, something I've changed my mind about. Spending money.
Hmm.
Yeah, I just picked up Start Late, Finish Rich. David, I think I got it right there. Bach, I think it is
Okay.
BACH. And literally last night, I wrote on my debit card and my PayPal card that goes against my PayPal balance the word necessary with a question mark, because he tells this story in the book about his grandmother. He's got a lot of stories about his grandmother and how she made her wealth. And one of them is asking the question, is this purchase necessary? And I'm like, okay, yeah, I can think about that right now because I'm reading the book. But when I'm out and caught up in things, how am I going to remember? And I'm like, write it on the card.
Mm, that's
And then
good.
when you go to take out the card, it's like necessary. And I'm like, oh, yeah.
Very good.
So,
That's a very good
yeah.
one. What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Ooh. These are hard. I'm going to steal them. um, I guess that I'm not empathetic or emotional. I think people see
Mm,
me really as pretty like in control. And I'm that person at the store that doesn't work there, but someone will come up to me and say, do you know where I can find or is there someone working that register, that sort of weird thing. And I'm like, what is it about my look? So I have this, not only the voice is kind of
yeah.
an authoritarian, which I use to describe it when I'm selling myself, but apparently I have that look too, like she knows the answer.
That
And
com
I
that
don't
com
always.
that com that comforting, like she can help me, or
I guess,
Great.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think yeah.
that's interesting. Well, Dawn, I'm super glad we were able to make this work, and
Yes.
it's been a while in the making. I think we had a couple of reschedules, but as we both know now, and I think you know because of your intuitive abilities, the right things happen at the right time and when they're supposed to. So I'm glad we got to tell your story. I think what you're doing is amazing for the
Thank you.
community there, and I'm excited that more people are going to hear about it by virtue of this episode. And you're only covering one of the deserts there, so I don't know how many others in the world, but you could actually
Right, exactly. I know. Well,
franchise out the podcast.
yes, I'm going out to, Vegas to house sit for an old landlord from LA who just bought a place out there, and she goes, "Well, I live in the desert now, you can interview me."
Yeah,
So,
that's
I don't know,
true.
we might branch out, and I have some feelers out to other areas of the Mojave as
Mm.
well. So, if I can get my Zoom or Tascam, I'm on it.
So, where's the best place for folks to stay connected with you and to find out more about the show?
They can go to the website, desertladydiaries.com, and it's on social media, Facebook and Instagram as Desert Lady Diaries. And there wasn't enough room on Twitter, so I had to go with Desert Lady Diary,
Okay.
singular.
Perfect. We'll make sure we have all those notes and all those links in the show notes. So thanks again,
Great.
and hope you have a fantastic day.
Thanks. You too. Take care.
Thanks again to Dawn for coming on the show. Always appreciate it. Always enjoy hearing the many different ways podcast hosts are using their skills, their unique set of skills to tell their stories. And what's cool about what Dawn does is that she's doing them in person out in the desert by Joshua Tree, which I've been to, and it's an awesome place, very inspiring. And what's also interesting is that she has no shortage of guests that she's going to be interviewing, and they're all women that are doing fantastic things. So make sure you check that out. Don't forget to support our sponsor, Focusrite, and their awesome line of gear, and specifically the Scarlett 2i2, now in its third generation. Tune in next week for our conversation with another pair of folks doing amazing things in the podcasting space. This time it's Zach and Rock, co-founders of Squadcast.fm. And if that sounds familiar, it's a service I've been raving about for probably over a year now since I've been working with them, and I've actually met them 2 years ago. So I can't say enough good things about the team, and I'm excited for you to hear that conversation. So that's going to be episode 199 as we roll into 200. And if you're a regular listener, you already know who guest 200 is going to be. Again, full show notes are available at podcastjunkies.com/198. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. If you made it this far, no doubt you're listening out for the retention hashtag. It's going to be Desert Dawn, DESERT Dawn, DAWN. That's the hashtag, and you can tag her at Desert Lady Diary, and that's singular, LADY, so Desert Lady Diary, and me at podcast_junkies. Thanks for all you do to support the show. Super excited to close in on episode 200. It's going to be a fun ride, and I'll talk to you guys next week.